It's thinking on the fly. It's doing stuff that actually I think chefs excel at. We adjust. That's why we got the job. This whole pandemic has brought to light the resiliency, I think, of the restaurant industry, the resiliency of the chef to interpret the moment.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. The pandemic has changed our lives. The huge upheaval has made us rethink everything we do. In the food industry, it's destroyed businesses, careers, and livelihoods, but it's also set many on a new path out of need or out of opportunity. But there are some that were already on a mission to change our perception and connection with food for the greater good. Dan Barber is the chef and co-owner of Blue Hill at Stone Barns and Blue Hill in Greenwich Village, New York. Dan, how are you?
Great to be here.
Thanks for joining us. What's it like in New York at the moment? It's been a hell of a year. What's it like there just now?
Well, right now it is. We're at a moment where you feel like you're on the precipice, and the which way does it go? It's a very unsettling moment. In some ways, more so than even the height of the pandemic, because you don't know which way the coin is gonna fall here. So we know that places very near to New York City are in it now with a lot of cases rising, but New York City itself is doing okay. How long does that last for? We don't know.
You've got a pretty important election in the next few days. How important is the outcome of that?
Well, you would have a very good perspective on that from the world stage, from the American stage. I think this is a critical moment uh, to define how we enter into the future, and are we going to do it in a way that's going to confront some of the daunting challenges we have ahead of us, or are we going to revert back to um, a kind of ethically corrupt, morally bankrupt, and really backward view of how we conduct ourselves.
As you just sort of mentioned, we sort of have a sort of window into what's going on in America during this time, and it's been frightening to watch in Australia. We've had an impact here, but not quite as extreme as in the US. Can you take us back to the early stages of and the impact that it had on what you do with your restaurants?
Well, in the middle of March, we had to close Blue Hill uh, and Blue Hill in New York City, two restaurants, Blue Hill at Stone Barns, which is just outside the city. And New York City is in the middle of the West Village, and we overnight had to close. And like many restaurants, we were trying to figure out what to do. We ended up creating a box program that allowed our suppliers to continue supplying us and getting paid for it. And to us, this was critical because we knew we wanted to reopen at some point, and we didn't want these suppliers to disappear. And what we realized when we shut down was that many of these suppliers, these farmers, were in real peril. And that launched our to-go box program, and eventually allowed us to open for picnics outdoors. And now tonight I'm speaking to you in the midst of the first indoor service we have, which is one table per room. We have several rooms. These are old stone barns where I'm talking to you from outside of New York City in Westchester. And there's several nooks and crannies for which we're putting tables that essentially are your own room for a multi-course feast. And you come as a family or a group of friends that know each other and have been around each other. And we give you a very limited service, but multi-course tasting feast.
After so long without the restaurant being open to welcome guests in, what's it felt like this last week preparing for this evening?
It's yet again the feeling of reopen, changing our game, which is it's thinking on the fly. It's doing stuff that actually I think chefs excel at. We adjust. That's why we got the job. So in some ways, the this whole pandemic has brought to light the resiliency, I think, of the restaurant industry, the resiliency of the chef to interpret the moment. And a lot of restaurants and chefs are doing quite well at that.
The experience that you give at Blue Hill is quite different to many restaurants. How different is the offering that you have right now compared to the experience people would have before the pandemic?
Well, right now, I mean, we're serving 4 or 5 courses with very minimal service, and I'm looking out from my corner office in the kitchen out at 7 cooks. Pre-COVID, March 14th, we had 46 cooks in the kitchen.
Wow.
So it's a very strange environment. But it's I gotta have to say that I mean, look, it's like a roller coaster with me. I go up and down, but I I think you can do very good food in a very different environment, and I never thought that was possible. So I'm learning during this and reevaluating what's important, as we all are.
You've really had a mission to have a greater connection to the food we eat. When did that journey kind of start for you?
I don't know that I have a point demarcated for the beginning, um, but I grew up partly at Blue Hill Farm, which is a dairy farm in Western Massachusetts. Um, so I was inculcated into this idea of open space and pasture land and animals and sort of responsibility. And I think that infused itself into my pursuit of cooking and how I cook. I think that experience of being connected to agriculture was probably critical for my thinking. So it set me on a type of ethic that I have to say wasn't brought on by an ethical compass, but much more by the pursuit of flavor. Like I want to say that I'm first and foremost an environmentalist because we all want to say that. But if you ask me the question of how do you get on this journey, the truth was I wanted to look like a better chef, and I had a style of food that gastronomically was just very simple. It was very simple plating and very straightforward, and because of that, I was relying very much on the purity of flavor and not hiding anything. Not because I didn't believe that there's great food that's complex and multidimensional, and therefore can do things with combinations of ingredients that is really magical. It's not to say I don't believe in that. It's to say that that wasn't my style for some reason, and I'm a kind of naked chef on the plate. There's never more than 2 or 3 ingredients on the plate, and I don't cook with spices. I don't cook with heavy sauces. I'm really a minimalist, and so it drove me to evaluate flavor in that context, which was shorn of some of the accoutrements and flavor additives that are a part of great gastronomy, not just bad gastronomy, also part of great gastronomy. So that was just my style, and it led me to zero in on a kind of farming that produced those jaw-droppingly delicious flavors.
There's a common theory in food that simplicity is one of the greatest things in food that a chef can master, but it's also one of the most difficult because there's nowhere to hide on the plate.
I think that's probably the same of a great podcast and a great great writing and great art in general. Is how do you master the simplicity, because it's so difficult. So I don't want to pretend that I'm doing something that no other artistic pursuit uh, uh, doesn't try to do. I'm just saying my style was extreme, and so therefore the flavors of what I was working with really had to be um, uh, uh, superlative, and that led me to understand, well, where do those kind of ingredients come from? And then I realized definitely they came from farmers that were local to me, not just because I was talking to them and getting to know them, but I started to get to know their farming practices, and I recognized very quickly that those farmers that I really gravitated towards were farmers that were organic, and that were practicing a great degree of diversity on their farm. And and those are the farmers that I kept ordering from and being a part of and growing up with, really. Which is why when COVID hit, and all of a sudden I realized that yes, we had grown up together, and that we were, they were dependent on me as much as I was dependent on them. And that's why I started. That's why I kept going, because I in whatever way I could, because I felt if I ever wanted to come back without them, I wasn't. What was I? That was a reckoning moment.
There's many chefs on the planet that try to get a stage or work and spend some time at Blue Hill because it's such a unique experience. What is it like for a chef to work on the farm and in the kitchen there? What happens on the day to day?
Well, I think what the day to day is was at pre-COVID, was for 15 years, was as much an educational experience as it was a job. I mean, we spent hours pre-service in the morning. I mean, it was very long hours, but in the morning it was really an hour and a half to 2 hour meeting regarding what products we were going to be working with that day, and we never had menus. We never had a printed menu, so we were doing on average about 35 courses per table, but without a menu. So we had a playlist of dishes that we would work for the night, but we often had ingredients that were only good for a couple of tables. We test a lot of seeds, and so we had a lot of varieties that we just had a handful of this and that. And so we would create menus for the table, and so that led to some very exciting evenings, but also some very tense-filled evenings. And so it's very hard. It's a very hard kitchen to work in, but you get a lot out of it, I think, because you're understanding the connection between the flavors and the products that you're working with, and the kind of agriculture that it takes to produce that. And that's a very that's a kind of connection that becomes a compass point for a cook when they become a chef of their own restaurant. So we were breeding, hopefully, the next generation of awareness that we're very lucky to be in a place 20 miles from New York City that is surrounded by 250 acres of really productive farmland. So it's a blessing, and so yes, we tried very hard to take advantage of that.
The events of the last year or so has really put a focus on what we do with the environment and how we interact. Um, but you've been on this mission to have a greater connection for a long time. But do you think that'll change for you, given what's happened this year? Have you changed during this time?
Well, I don't know who hasn't changed. If you rip Van Winkle and you've been asleep, then maybe you don't change. But I have, I have, yeah, I've had some reckoning, um, personally, and that's a lot about the high end restaurant experience. In a moment where right now in America, 1 in 4 children are food insecure, which means most of them are going somewhat hungry for their next course or their next meal, or at least uh, don't have the assurance that the next meal will be there. 1 in 4 in the richest country in the world. That happened overnight in COVID. So do I personally see the necessity of quickly reopening Blue Hill and charging $400 a person for a menu? No, I don't. I mean, I always felt these issues. I don't know any good chef who doesn't think about hunger and nutrition, which is another. I think that might be the takeaway from COVID. In America, I don't know about Australia. I'm interested in Australia. What you feel the takeaway would be for me, and my sense is that we will have a connection and a consciousness about food that we never had, because if for any other reason then COVID has exposed the connection between food and health. I was just seeing a statistic that said that COVID related deaths are now blamed on 92% of them. 92% have underlying conditions. And of the underlying conditions, 90% of those 92%, 90% of 92% are food related. They're either diabetes, obesity, or some kind of heart disease that tracks itself to cardiovascular disease. It tracks itself to high cholesterol or hypertension or food related, all food related. And what that says is that we're a very sick country, uh, and much of that sickness comes from our diet. And we're holding out hope for this vaccine. And I am too. But a vaccine, people tend to forget a vaccine isn't a cure-all. A vaccine is an immunity booster. That's what it is. But so is food. So is food. So that understanding the relationship between our own immunity, whatever we are faced with, and nutrient dense food is becoming much more absolute. And I think in the takeaway to COVID, whatever this is, whatever it is, ends, I think that's going to be the story, and or one of the stories, and the failure of our politicians to adequately deal with this threat, but or this reality. I was just on a call with a scientist earlier today. He told me that in America, uh, I was talking to him about those underlying conditions, obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. He said, well, just diabetes alone, their team had been looking at that. And he said if COVID had hit in 1975 in the United States, just based on the number of type 2 diabetic adults in the US, just based on that, COVID would have been a bad flu season. Yeah. Which says to you, type 2 diabetes, as we all know, is completely preventable. It was 100% diet. And so what that says is that, had our diets been right, we would not be in the position we're in now. And that's illuminating and powerful, because you can take control as an individual, to vote with your forks and be engaged in the world, through food advocacy, not just for your health but for the health of the planet.
The hospitality sector globally is renowned for really low profit margins, but a really creative, passionate industry. What impact has it had on the US industry? How do you see that coming out of the pandemic?
Well, it's a tale of two worlds here. I mean, the industry, I'm assuming you're meaning the large scale food industry, and the large scale food industry has done brilliantly well in the last couple of months. There's two stories coming out of the United States. One story is local, independent, small farms are doing very well on a gross basis, meaning people are spending a lot of money at these farms because they recognize that their health is really important, and a lot of people don't want, and for that reason, a lot of people don't even want to go into a supermarket. So there's a couple of reasons happening there. But simultaneously and somewhat confusingly, the processed food industry is also, um, as one executive said to me a few months ago, it's morning in America again. And what he described was a moment pre March 2020 where big food and big agribusiness and processed food was really on the way out in America. The millennial and Generation Z, these young people, just turning their backs completely on food with multi ingredients, with processing, food without a story. I mean, nobody wanted that, and they were turning their backs on it. But in a COVID world, for the sake of convenience and being at home, it's a very different story. So, uh, the question, and I don't have the answer, is what happens when we start to circle out of this? What does it look like? And I'm buoyed by the idea that the local food movement is in some ways thriving. Again, the transaction costs of producing local food, in other words, packing boxes for the home and doing the kinds of things that local farmers never did. I don't know that it's profitable. And when I talk to farmers, the end result might not be profitable at all, but the gross sales are very strong. But simultaneously, so are the gross sales, so are the sales of the processed food industry in a way that, as this executive told me, he hasn't seen in a generation. So how this shakes out, I don't know. I don't know. I wonder what's happening in Australia. Is it the same kind of dichotomy?
There is. There is a greater connection to boutique, bespoke, small growers and producers, and a realization that the connection with food is more important than we perhaps realized.
Well, that mirrors the United States. When I wrote a book called The Third Plate, and I did a book tour in Australia, and I I was struck just by the Australian story is very similar to the American story in the sense of it being a relatively young country with with a farming history that really is extractive and a food culture that's based on that kind of extractive agriculture policies, largely very wasteful, protein centric, etc. Um, and the parallels between the U.S. and Australia, I found striking. Um, and so, we both have a lot to learn from each other as we try and circle out of not just this pandemic, but a relationship with food and food culture that's really abysmal, and it is a ripe for actually some very exciting possibilities that I think is being driven largely by the younger generation who's demanding food with a story and food without denuding flavor or nutrition.
You mentioned that health and immunity and things like diabetes are things that can be um, changed by your own influence and can affect not only the food industry but our own health. What's some of the simple things people can do to change that helps the smaller producers and helps with our own immunity?
Well, I think buying from farmers markets and local producers is the number one way to move the needle here. But so is cooking. I mean, the fact that you cook at home is a big step because it means someone else not cooking for you, and generally that's a very good thing. It's tastier, it's healthier, it's less wasteful, it's less impactful on the environment. So there's a lot there that's very exciting. Um, and I do think there's a reality to it where it costs more. Um, I'm not convinced that it costs a lot more. I generally love a good whole grain and some beans, and I find that to be one of the great, black beans and rice, or black beans and barley are like one of the great meals. I don't know that we need uh, much more than that, and it's very cheap, and nutrient dense and delicious. We both, Australia, United States, both have this westernized conception of a plate of food, of a dinner, which is somehow owed to us, which is 6 or 7 ounces of protein that centers a plate with a little bit of grain or a little bit of vegetables, a smattering of this and that. But really, it's protein centric, lunch and dinner 7 days a week, and that not only is not delicious, but the carrying capacity of land will not allow that into the future. And America and Australia, to a certain extent, had these virgin soils, which did enable that to develop. But that game is done, or about to be done, and we need a new paradigm for the architecture of a plate of food and the expectation for dinner. And one place to look, I think, is at historical cuisines around the world. It's just different cultures and cuisines. Nobody, you can't point to one culture and cuisine that has lasted, meaning it's it's withstood this very important test of time, where protein is 6 or 7 ounces twice a day, 7 days a week. That just doesn't exist. And we ought to recognize that and celebrate it, because that's what all cultures and cuisines have done. Peasant Italian, peasant French, the thousand varieties of Chinese varieties, of the Indian food, every Japanese meal, anywhere. Nobody does what we do. Um, and I would argue, since I just named some of the most delicious cuisines in the world, that you're not giving up anything. You're actually moving more towards a kind of hedonism and pleasure that could be very
Yeah.
exciting.
You've made a pretty big announcement this year in regards to your role with the restaurants. Can you tell us a bit about that and what led to that decision?
Well, I'm stepping aside from the kitchen, where I'm sitting right now in 2021, and we're going to turn Blue Hill over to a cohort of some very exciting, unknown chefs
Wow.
with some radical diversity compared to what I do, which is very Eurocentric. Um, and as I said, very simple. These are chefs that you've never heard of, that are blazing a path, uh, for a very distinct cuisine, a very distinct pattern of eating that celebrates a particular place. They're going to reinterpret it based on our farms, that I'm sitting on, and my Blue Hill farm, my family farm, the dairy farm, and also the farms that surround us. So it's gonna look very different, but the core of it is going to allow us to experience a good agriculture through the eyes of some very different chefs with very different experiences. So one part of it is, allowing chefs who fly under the radar to have more exposure because of the incredible gift I was given by having a kitchen at Blue Hill at Stone Barns, which is the old Rockefeller estate, and the pedestal that I was put on just by luck. It was a casino in the sky, and I hit jackpot. So allowing me to step aside for a moment and giving these chefs a voice, not just because I'm fascinated by, for example, Sri Lankan food. And I just today got off the phone with a gentleman who I'm hoping is going to do the residency, who believes that southwestern Nigerian cuisine is a very distinct foodway that hasn't been unexplored. And that's where he's from. So he's talking about things that issues I didn't even know were issues. I mean, it was just amazing. And so these are the kind of chefs that we want to selfishly learn from, but also take the opportunity to share some of the limelight with, and um, uh, hopefully have them interpret the landscape in a different way than I do. And as I said, if you look to some of these historical cuisines, you find a pattern of farming and agriculture that, in its rudimentary way, was really resilient. Uh, Obviously organic, but very resilient and complementary. And so, what does it take to create a menu that supports that kind of farming? That's the question, and that's where we're. That's always been the question for me. And now we're going to turn it over to other chefs to answer that question through their interpretation. And so I'm really excited about it.
This period of time has been challenging, and as you mentioned, there's still cases going up in certain areas in the US. But is there some positives to come out of this traumatic experience?
Well, yeah, I always try and look for the positives or the learnings. And it's hard to do that in a moment where Today we saw a spike of 44% um, infection rate in the United States. But if I could remove myself from that depressing statistic and say that, I hope the learnings are that cheap food ends up being very expensive. And we have an agriculture system that promotes cheap food. Uh, and in America, our tax dollars go to support it. And when you get into a situation like COVID, where immunity, natural immunity, is key, you start to see the real cost of that cheap food. And I hope that we have a different kind of national food policy, that we enact one in this country, and hopefully it rubs off on Australia or vice versa. We need a food policy that that first and foremost encourages the right kind of farming. Because if you encourage the right kind of farming, you encourage the right kind of eating. Period. That's what all those historical cuisines are all about, and why my residency program that I'm setting up, to me, is so exciting, because you're introducing chefs that are broadcasting a kind of agriculture and culture. Right, culture is at the in part of agriculture, is that it's a culture that supports the agriculture. It's a culture that supports the farming, the right kind of farming. The right kind of farming is always ends up being delicious, always, and more nutrient dense. The correspondence between truly um, ethical farming, organic, regenerative, and thoughtful, always leads to the best food. And that is a correspondence that's really, really celebratory. Um, and if we can, out of COVID, recognize the correspondence between eating and health, but also pleasure, I think we have a shot at a new paradigm for the future. And I don't say that in a grandiose way. Um, I just think, I don't know if this is true of Australia, but one of the things that I have always admired about the American food culture, which is a funny thing to say because it's hard to say anything admiring about the American food culture. But if you could say something admiring about the American food culture, it would be that it adopts new ideas, new trends, new ideas with dizzying speed. I mean, that's just, Australia, I think, too, to a certain extent. I can tell you, and I'm sure you know as well, or if not better than I do, that that does not happen in India. That does not happen in Japan. That does not happen in China for the most part. Food trends take a long time to develop. In America, we volley back and forth between every new idea. So I think there's a moment to take capitalize here, and I do think that this generation can force some really dramatic changes that are long overdue.
As we move forward and get beyond COVID, what are you most looking forward to?
I'm personally, I'm struck by leaving the kitchen for a minute, because I've been cooking for 30 years and I have two young kids. And so COVID has allowed me to be a part of my daughter's lives in the evening that I never had been allowed to be a part of. So that's been very interesting and incredible. Um, so while I miss the restaurant, um, I don't miss those evenings when I was, missing them. Um, so that's a very, very, for me personally, very uh, exciting development.
You've got a pretty, as you said, you're on the precipice, pretty incredibly important election in the next few days. What's your hope for the outcome of that?
Well, I mean, I'd like to say my hope is that there's a new administration that places, a lot of emphasis on fixing some problems with agriculture that are deep seated and have gotten worse under the Trump administration. But at this point, we just need a new administration. We need a new face for America, and I hope that in this time of crisis, we have the kind of leadership that can do bold changes. That's what I hope for, because we need it. We need it for our health and for the health of the planet. Um, which as we all know is is in peril like never before.
Well, we're truly honoured to have you share your story in the middle of your first service for so long. It's pretty extraordinary that you would give us your time.
Oh well,
Um,
thank you. I'm happy to step away from cooking this new kind of meal that I'm doing with very limited service and only 7 cooks in the kitchen. But it's a pleasure to talk to you, and I just want to say that I follow the work that you do, and it's very important and inspiring. I also feel so inspired by the Australian people. I mean, my book tour there, it was going almost 8 years ago now, but I found it to be one of the most moving experiences of my life in talking to people about food and farmers. The farmers that I met that came out to meet me based on the book, it was extraordinary, and I do think there's I don't know how analogous the situation today is to what's happening in Australia, but my sense is that that kind of consciousness that I'm hoping will come out of America will come out of the people of Australia. I think food is increasingly a big part of the younger generation's um, interests, also in Australia, and that we'll see a sea change in these next couple of years. And I imagine that the great chefs of Australia and the interested in um, and the aerobic eaters of Australia, attentive and anaerobic eaters of Australia will begin a conversation that will lead to some serious change because we need it now, as I said, more than ever.
well, Dan, we are honoured to have you on Deep in the Weeds. Please keep in touch, and good luck with the year ahead, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to that. Well, let's catch up and compare notes in a couple of months. It would be very interesting.
We would love to. Thanks again, Dan.
Thanks so much. Bye bye.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we share the stories of Australia's hospo community, suppliers and producers in search of hope during this pandemic. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au. Stay safe and be well.